Hello, this is Muriel Rand, and this video is on planning assessments in early childhood education. When you're planning for your assessment for your lessons, I want you to think about both informal and formal assessments. Informal, or sometimes called formative assessments, happen all throughout the lesson. And you need to have these so that you can make sure that your lesson is going well, right? So informal assessments allow you to change your lesson as you're teaching to meet student needs. For example, maybe the kids are getting it already and they know this really well. You might decide, all right, I'm going to add a little bit more to my lesson right now, or I'm going to move things along more quickly. On the other hand, things might not be going well, and you want to slow it down and review some things. So your ability to know whether you should speed up or slow down or introduce new ideas or review is comes from your formative informal assessments. So your formal assessment or your summative, sum meaning at the end, it adds up everything, right? Summative. Your formal assessment is the final performance or the products that the students do. This could be a writing sample, a drawing, story retelling. It could be observing them counting, anything that happens, kind of the independent practice, right, of your lesson. And I want you to have a rubric to score that assessment. So here are some samples. Some of the sample informal assessments is you might be taking observational notes, like anecdotal notes from a turn and talk or from the questions that students ask or answer. It could be a checklist on who is showing an understanding of the story while you are reading it. It could be anecdotal notes on the language that children are using. It can be observing and just keeping track of what you're seeing from the students, again, during the lesson. The formal assessments happen during the independent practice at the end of the lesson. It could be a writing sample like journal writing, creating a page from a class book, filling in graphic organizers. It could be a story retelling. It could be, again, their language use. You know that you're focusing on vocabulary very heavily because that's so important in early childhood. Or comprehension, maybe a checklist of their ability to answer comprehension questions. For older children, perhaps a comprehension test questions, either oral or written. For math, this can be calculating problems, right? And giving them a problem set and helping them figure out what the problems are. So focus on what you are measuring in your assessment. It's super important that your assessment is the same as your objective. So if I'm teaching the kids how to recount a folktale, then I have to measure and assess that they're actually recounting a folktale. Do not put things in your assessment that are not in your objective. So for example, sometimes I see things in the assessments like the children's ability to work cooperatively, the children's ability to stay on task, the children's ability to cooperate or to get all of their work done. Unless that's your objective, that doesn't go in your assessment. Okay. Now, if your objective is for the kids to work cooperatively, then it can be in your assessment. But the assessment and the objective have to be the same. So here are some more examples. The students will be able to write or draw about what they observe on a nature walk. Well, then your assessment is the student work samples scored for the quality and number of items they wrote or drew. Example 3, the students will add descriptive details to their narrative writing. That could be a work sample of the student's narrative writing scored for the quality and number of descriptive details. They've got to exactly match. Here are some examples of rubrics. Again, I want you to create a rubric. Rubrics are especially helpful when you are using assessments where the children do something rather than a test or a quiz. And that's what we're focusing on here. I want your assessments to be active learning. So it's very helpful to have a rubric in order to score it. So here's an example of a rubric for sensory details in narrative writing. You can see that going across the rows are the different parts of my objective, and the columns are the different levels of performance. So they might have 4 or more number of details, and then the quality, all of the details relate to the 5 senses. You want to make sure that each row you are measuring only one thing. So I'm not going to put the number of details and the quality of the details in one row because that measures something that's different. Kids could do really well on the number of details, but poorly on the quality. Or they could do really well on the quality, but not as well on the number of details. So we have to separate them out and give a score for each of those criteria. Here's another example. Their children will use the target vocabulary words during free play, garden, plant, seeds, leaves, and soil. So I'm going to put on one row the number of words that they were able to use. Did they use the words correctly? Was the meaning correct? And the third part was showing confidence in using the words. So we've got 3 different lines. They measure different things. And then we've got the quality points going across. The objective, the students will be able to create a recipe using a title, 5 steps, and a drawing of the food. So I've got 3 things in my objective. There's going to be 3 things here in my rubric, including the title, the number of steps, and a drawing. And then the quality of each is in the rows. So the high quality is that the title is included and appropriate, that there's 4 or more steps, and that they include an appropriate drawing that shows details of the food. So those are kind of examples of what I'm looking for in the rubrics for your lessons. Now let's talk about modifying your lessons for learners with specific needs. I'm using the terms learners with specific needs. That could be a learner with an IEP. It could be a learner with a 504 plan. It could be an English language learner. It could be a learner that has ADHD and has trouble focusing. It could be gifted students that need more challenge. It could be students who are below level, even though they don't have a disability. So I'm sure you've heard these terms before, modification and accommodation. A modification is changing what they are learning. The accommodation is just changing how they are learning it. So in the modification, we're actually changing how hard it is. And in the accommodation, we're changing the way that they're going to learn it. So we're going to give them different ways of learning. So here, accommodations are changes that allow a student to demonstrate their learning on the same content and objectives as other students. They do not change the instructional level. For example, if I have a child that is deaf and I'm going to have a sign language interpreter, that's an accommodation. The learner is still learning the exact same thing that everybody else is learning, but they have the accommodation of somebody signing it for them. Our English language learners often get an accommodation. We will define words for them or give them a dictionary or use their home language to respond. But the content that they're doing is the same content. They still have to get all of the parts of the story, or they still have to understand the main idea, or they still have to add 6 plus 4, but they can use their home language to do it. That's an accommodation. It doesn't change the instructional level. On the other hand, some children need modifications. That's the changes in the difficulty of the content or the objectives. For example, if you have gifted learners, you might want to give them work that's harder. You might want to give them problems that involve 2 steps instead of 1 step. Or you might want them to remember 5 details of the story instead of 3 details. That is a modification. Here are some other examples. An accommodation might be to use a computer instead of handwriting, or handwriting instead of a computer, either one. Having questions read to them instead of reading them themselves, getting more time for an assessment, using adapted writing tools or a communication device, and responding in home language, which I mentioned already. You can see how those are different than the modifications. These are the modifications where they get fewer test questions, fewer ideas or details are expected. It's maybe easier texts to read or harder texts to read. We could also flip this around the other way. Fewer words to learn or more words to learn. Writing prompts or fewer paragraphs, fewer problems in a problem set if you're doing math. A graphic organizer partially filled in. They might only have to do the first part of it and then they'll do the second part the next day. So these are only for children who really have a disability or are gifted and need to have the actual difficulty changed rather than just a change in how they are learning the material or how they are demonstrating their learning of the material. So here's a way to modify the rubrics. In this one, we had the original rubric had 4 more details with all of the details relating to the 5 senses. This is a modification in which the number of details is only 2 or more, and the quality, some of the details, not all of them, relate to the 5 senses. So you can see how we've modified that rubric. Now, finally, let's talk about multimodal assessment. What I'm looking for in your assessments is that they are developmentally appropriate. Children in preschool through 3rd grade should not be doing a lot of tests and quizzes and worksheets. I don't want to see that. We have enough of that in the schools, and it's sucking the life out of schooling, and it is killing the souls of both teachers and children. We need to go back to our roots, and I want your assessments to be multimodal. That means the children are using all of their senses. They're utilizing varied approaches to learning and to demonstrating that learning. And I'd like it best is to include more than one modality, such as social learning, play-based assessments, oral assessments, art related to literacy, observations of activity, movement. Remember, we're integrating arts so that arts can be a way of assessing what the children know. Let me give you an example. I was in a classroom the other day in which the preschool teacher was doing Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and as a STEM extension, children built built a bed for Goldilocks. And the children were English language learners, and they had a tremendous difficulty explaining the bed that they did make for Goldilocks. But when you looked at their artwork, you could see their details and their understanding of the story and their understanding of the science principles that they were learning in a way that you just didn't get that from their language alone. That's why our assessments need to be multimodal. So consider that. I know this is a lot to consider in your assessments, but creating good assessments is one of the hallmarks of being a really good teacher. So I hope this helps and that you have some time to think about this and come up with assessments that are really appropriate for your lessons.